Time has a funny habit of passing by extremely quickly when you know you should be working on something else, doesn't it? Anyhow, I didn't want to go a year without uploading a video again, and since I'd prefer to test out a new editing software on a relatively simpler project, I thought I'd update my favorite video games list with what I've played over the past year. For time's sake, I'm only breaking down the new stuff, so if you want to hear my opinions on previously played titles, feel free to check my prior uploads. Now, even though some of the ordering moved around, I find that games mostly stayed within the same vicinity, meaning it shouldn't be too hard to track them down. Without further ado. Honorable mention. A Hat in Time. First off, let me just state that I have yet to beat the game, but where I left off, I'm right before the final boss, so I'm at least close enough for an honorable mention shout-out. Now, as a fan of 3D platformers, this title piqued my interest, but after trying this out, it reminded me less of the ones on the Nintendo 64, and more the GameCube era, maybe more specifically the title of Super Mario Sunshine, especially since the first locale happens to be a beach. To not beat around the bush, I prefer the N64 era, particularly with this genre, but I'm not opposed to alternate experiences, which as a result elicited a few interesting observations and comparisons on my part. First off, the title pulls off something extremely fascinating, where the protagonist feels distant, yet highly personable, like you only know her as Hat Girl, and not by some real name. Likewise, the story reveals that she happens to be returning home from something, but you don't exactly know what, and the fact that this presumably young girl happens to travel alone via a spaceship completely tailored to her own liking further raises questions about who or what she might be. Taking it a step further, she dresses as a magician, and the source of fuel for her ship happens to be magical hourglasses capable of manipulating time, which again prompts more inquiry into her as a person, and or her home civilization. Anyway, for all I know, every single one of these questions could receive an answer at the conclusion of the game, but for how well its opening established intrigue earns it a lot of praise in my book. On the personal level, many of her mannerisms and gestures give off a strong cute vibe, like she can pretty much interact with every gadget on her vessel, and in addition to that she has a pit of plushies in her room, which itself unveils a lot about her person. So, again, the game crafts her a strong identity, so even if you don't know who she is, you still can understand her. Switching over to the explorable worlds themselves, what also gave me more of a Super Mario Sunshine vibe rather than a Mario 64 one, regarded how with the game's signature collectibles, the hourglasses, you gathered them in a more linear sense, the Sunshine approach, rather than 64's way of being dumped off into a world, and randomly stumbling upon them. For example, in A Hat in Time, you begin a world with a chapter select screen, and upon picking one, it would set up a course of events for you to collect a single hourglass. Other than the occasional time distortion hourglass randomly appearing in a world, something which quite resembles the secret courses of Sunshine, you can only find one hourglass per chapter. Anyway, I prefer the openness of Mario 64 to A Hat in Time / Sunshine style. To be fair, I should mention that technically some of the later worlds of A Hat in Time have a free roam, but I still view it as more akin to Sunshine's linear way. For the record, this happens to be the final game I'm writing about, and I'm partly only including it to address a comment I make in a later entry, where I stated that some of its levels can feel too specific, and what I meant by that regards how just because a level has an idea behind it, doesn't mean it has an identity. Like the first major area of the game happens to be an idyllic beach city overrun by the mafia, so it establishes an environment and an enemy group, but it's, I'll just say, clash in tones, and her lack of emphasis on certain aspects almost sends mixed messages on how you should interpret the level. Basically, I kind of believe that the area itself should tell its own story, and I think that with this locale, it required too much narrator and or character intervention to establish a motive. Now, I'm not calling the level itself bad per se. I quite enjoyed how Chapter 3 of World 1 occurred at night, and I also like how the very first time you enter this world it begins in a dark, enclosed hallway littered with trash, only to open up and reveal a bright sunny world, but I still feel like it relied too much on outside explanation for proper setup. Moving on, the special abilities. For starters, I quite enjoy the fact that the unique powers of the story derive from hats, but in spite of that I kind of wish the game would have included more of them, as you only acquire 5 of them, in a certain sense really only 4, as one of them happens to be a late game gimmick to toy around with, and not actually function as a way to move the story forward. Anyway, as I have yet to beat a hat in time, and only included it as an honorable mention, I think I should cut it off here. For those interested in why I discontinued this title, I started playing in November of this year, and during a Black Friday sale I received what I thought was a time-sensitive $1 offer for a 2-week trial of Game Pass, so I took the deal up instead, and nearing the end of said period, a few devoted and longtime fans of mine on YouTube inquired if I had any videos in the works, and needless to say that inspired me to work on this project instead of returning to the game. I just thought I'd include that if anyone wondered about my status with the game. 145. Dragon Quest III. 144. Super Metroid. 143. Catherine. 142.
Drakengard.
141. Jak and Daxter, The Precursor Legacy. 140. Princess Peach, Showtime. 139. Neon White. Being upfront, I'm likely giving this title a bit of an unfair bump, since this happens to be the last game completed before finishing this list, so it likely hasn't had the adequate time to linger around long enough to properly settle, so in all honesty my opinion might be subject to change. Plus, on top of that, the fact that this happens to originate from an indie studio, meaning that it likely never received the accolades it deserves, gives me a bit of a compulsion to give it some extra credit, so that might indirectly influence its ranking too, but regardless, here's Neon White. To begin, for video games I generally don't follow the notion of gameplay above all else, but in this unusual circumstance I preferred it to every other aspect, even the story. Now essentially this game functions as a first-person, time trial, speed-running type of game, where per level you have to eliminate a set number of enemies and reach a checkpoint as quickly as possible. By the way, you won't automatically fail a challenge if you don't complete it within a certain time limit, which for reasons soon to be known, is a massive positive in my book, more on that later. But instead of just being a mindless killing simulator, it also places a strong emphasis on puzzle solving, so it doesn't feel brainless either. For example, certain foes upon death, if killed near to the player, will launch you up in the air, and in many cases be the only method of reaching the next portion of the level, meaning that sometimes to progress onwards you actually have to plan out your next moves and not just blindly slaughter everything. Likewise, besides bullet firing, the various weapons of the game provide unique effects. For instance, expending an entire clip of pistol ammo will grant you a boosted jump. The rifle will propel you forwards a great distance, but only directly ahead, not upwards either. The SMG will slam you into the ground as rapidly as possible, and the bazooka can act as a grappling hook of sorts. So, with all these variations, it almost becomes fun in and of itself to think about all the minor ways in how you can shave time off your completion score, like the drop from an SMG will greatly assist you in a descent-themed level. At the same time though, this aspect also encourages accuracy, as if you waste ammo on enemies, you might lose access to a special ability that can hastily end a level. On top of that, combining the effects of all these weapons and enemies can be a thrill in and of itself too. Like pistol super jumping into an explosive enemy, which launches you upwards, then rifling into 2 or 3 more of those foes, and ending it off with bazookaing yourself to the top of a skyscraper. Putting it bluntly, just from sheer covered distance alone feels awesome. In essence, the game just crafted a really good system to play around with. Besides that too, taking into account the order of operations also makes this a fun rhythm type of game too. Just for reference, upon death some enemies drop these specialty weapons, and if you have nothing in hand, the protagonist wields a simple and weak sword that takes a significantly longer time to slay opponents, so in some scenarios you might have to snipe an enemy first, then after that use the weapon's alternate function to reach the next platform to achieve a quicker time. What really elevated the puzzle-solving mechanic to the next degree pertained to having to find a hidden gift in each level, which in some cases might be hard to miss, but reaching them happens to be an entirely different story. Like you might have to avoid using weapons or discover a level exploit allowing you to save your resources for one final burst at the end. Something like to reach a tower off in the distance requires the special effects of 3 rifles and 2 super jumps. Building off the term exploit, the levels themselves have great design as well, as many of them contain hidden loopholes to trim down your time or conserve your resources, like one area might require you to use the secondary effect of a rifle to break down/penetrate a wall, followed by a situation of having to climb up some stairs to eliminate a foe, and then use an SMG slam to destroy the floor. But if you played through the level a few times you might realize that you can skip that segment entirely by jumping around the side of the structure, sniping an enemy through an open window, and then move on to the next partition. Anyway, quite often discovering these secrets leave you feeling incredibly smart afterwards. To be fair, I must mention that some harder levels and the acquiring of certain gifts can become very frustrating due to their difficulty. On to the other aspects of the game, beginning with the characters. In all honesty, they mostly feel like generic anime archetypes: the excitable best friend, a cutesy but chaotic immature girl, the domineering femme fatale, and a cool protagonist who can be awkward around girls. Likewise, I view the story as nothing special either. For reference, this partially happens to be why I prefer the gameplay, but I will say both aspects do allow for some positives, like one of the narratives centers around the theme of breaking repeating cycles, which I find all too fitting about a game designed around replaying the same levels over and over again in an effort to acquire the shortest possible time. One other quality about the cast revolves around how in a Reservoir Dogs style fashion every character's name begins with the word neon and ends with a color, and how this ties into the game in an interesting fashion. One that might often go unnoticed pertains to how sometimes a character's signature hue plays into an area's color aesthetic, especially if they might be the focus of the chapter/level. Like some of Neon Violet's locales take place in a purple skyscraper-ridden town. Similarly, those belonging to the game's villain Neon Green often occur inside a surrealistic green wasteland. Speaking of aesthetic, I have to praise this game's atmosphere and ambience, as quite often it employs a heavy use of the color white, especially for buildings, usually coinciding with blue backdrops and flooring, all of which induce a very heavenly or ethereal mood, which, if you know the point of the story, perfectly captures the intended mood. I even have to say the music meshes well with the visuals and ambience too. 138. Dead or Alive 5, Last Round. 137. Spider-Man. 136. Resistance 3. 135. Mace, The Dark Age. 134. Devil May Cry 3, Dante's Awakening. 133. Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury. 132. Street Fighter 4. 131. Joy Mech Fight. 130. Phantasy Star 4, The End of the Millennium. 129. Mega Man X. 128. Psychonauts 2. Now, if you've watched my prior upload about my favorite video games, you would know that the original Psychonauts landed in my top 5, and in my discussion for it I actually predicted why I didn't think I would view this title as favorably, even when the critics tried to argue this as the superior of the two, and let's just say that in my opinion much of what I feared came true. To begin, what I first kind of disliked about this sequel revolved around the fact that it felt like a giant humiliation ritual for the protagonist Raz. At the end of the first title he earned the rank of a full Psychonaut, only for in this continuation his prior actions to not be recognized, thus relegating him to the position of a junior trainee. Of course, none of the mentors who he previously saved/garnered the respect of never really stood up for him. Then after that his new peers shamed and tricked him multiple times, one of which occasions results in two of his idols seeing him in nothing but his underwear, him being assigned a mentor of a mailman incapable of wielding psychic powers, and finally after the completion of the first real level, for some reason or other his family comes to embarrass him right in front of his new friends. So in all honesty it feels like one continuous slap in the face right after another. Now, I understand that for a video game, especially a sequel at that, to provide a sense of upward mobility a protagonist might have to be knocked down a peg or two, but Psychonauts 2 took it way too far, and in my opinion it never really felt like the hero got the redemption he deserved, especially among his classmates. In all fairness, some might argue that resetting them against a boss sufficed, but to me they did not get drugged down anywhere near enough to justify his treatment, plus I think there should have been a chance to totally outshine them. Switching gears, the levels, first off I find it only fair to admit that since I rated the original game so highly, in reviewing these new ones I will probably rub off as biased, like this isn't exactly like the style of the first game, therefore it's bad, but in spite of that I do feel like I have some legitimate criticisms of the new levels. For example, one new area has you dive into the mind of an alcoholic, and in it you have to sail around a sea of booze with various islands representing points of his life, usually these segments initiated by diving into a bottle. Now in my opinion I have to say this does not seem like the actual mind of an alcoholic, but the world of a person trying to portray someone as being an alcoholic, i.e. it feels insincere to the source, like the original Psychonauts excelled at making the explored minds seem authentic to their character. A cold scientific person who has shed most of his emotions resides on a black and white cube floating in the void of space, or the inner world of a conspiracy theorist presents an idyllic world twisted into an unorganized mess, and likewise all of its denizens act suspicious. So this implies that the mind of this person can't interpret reality correctly, as well as their skeptical views of people display signs of paranoia on their part. Again, the mental worlds from the original Psychonauts game actually feel like someone's true thoughts and mind, whereas again the new ones rub off as symbolic representations of a person conceived of by an outside source, and to me this pretty much applies to all the new explorable minds of the story too. Weirdly enough, many of my least favorite levels happen to have been the longest ones, while most of my favorites happen to have been on the shorter end, so this also lessened my experience with the game. Length does play a part in this role, but I do think it goes a little beyond that. For example, in the mind of the alcoholic, a few segments portrayed him as a disembodied head being flown around the area, and in these parts he happened to be drunkenly mumbling, which became obnoxious extremely fast. Now I'm not necessarily opposed to annoying segments in video games if they have artistic merit, but this felt like nothing more than just another way to reinforce him as an alcoholic. To not look like I'm totally biased against everything in this level, I'll say it did have a good humorous moment, as he happens to be the granduncle of a friend of yours, but since his alcoholism distanced him from his family he has only seen pictures of her, but never heard her actual voice, so when you encounter the image of this person in his mind, she speaks with a totally different sounding voice. Anyway, I'll say I did like this aspect. Next, another level based itself around the art style of the Beatles' Yellow Submarine animated film. Now in context this does follow a fun premise, as this represents its musically oriented mental resident experiencing sensory overload after being deprived of his senses for a long time, and the point of this as an area has you retrieving his lost sensory systems. Again, a good overall intention, as you could say the intensity of the color and appearance can easily overwhelm, thus mirroring what the mind of this character experiences, but the level and art style drag on for so long that it starts to beat a dead horse. Explore the performance area, go climb this mountain to find the first sense, traverse the concession area for the next two, and it does this for like 5 sections, so yeah, it just became tedious and repetitive. Plus after a while it actually started to hurt my eyes. One aspect I did enjoy about the levels of Psychonauts 2 involved how it incorporated significantly shorter areas into the fray too, and it possessed an interesting rationale behind it too, as it reflected all the different personas of a person suffering from split personality disorder, essentially a fragmented mind splintered into a bunch of mini-levels. Beyond the strong supporting premise, I'd even call these areas the best atmospherically and most fun. A mailroom where a tornado of letters swirl below and you have to ride hovering streams of them across the room, a green-tinted city with a 1940s aesthetic, where you have to ride a bowling ball up and down its rooftops, or a dark and gloomy area where you have to scale up a lighthouse built from human hair, all while fighting off lice-like insects. Anyway, I got to call this set short, sweet, and to the point. In pointing this out as well, Psychonauts 2 added a few quality-of-life improvements to its levels not present in the first title, like for both this game and its predecessor. In each area you had to collect mental illustrations known as figments. Now the original provided only the number of how many you collected, and the amount that remained, whereas the sequel now also portrayed the images of the ones you have yet to pick up, which could be used as hints to find out what you're missing out on. For example, in the Drunkard's Ocean level, I gathered all but one figment, and struggled to find the last remaining one, but upon looking at the newly included menu icon, I noticed I missed out on a coconut, and because I knew they grew on trees, that indirectly implanted the idea in my head that I should search an island with palm trees, and sure enough, because of that I found them. So this quality of life improvement aided me in 100%ing this level. At first I possessed mixed feelings with this aspect, as it felt like it rendered the collecting aspect of this game too easy, but as this continuation contains significantly larger explorable areas than its predecessor, I ultimately realized this to be the right decision. Onto the new psychic abilities of the game, which in all honesty I must confess kind of defied my expectations, as since I felt the first entry covered most established mental powers, I didn't believe the developers had anything of substance to add here, or at least without venturing too off the funny farm, but yeah, they pretty much proved me wrong. For example, one new ability could slow the passage of time, and in the context of the story it actually has a good reason/origin for its implementation, as a decades-long coma of sorts warped a psychic character's perception of time, thus granting him the ability, and he later taught it to Raz. Concerning its application to gameplay, a power like this just by itself inherently meshes well with the nature of platformers, but with the dreamlike dungeons of Psychonauts not having to abide by normal physics, something like a waterfall flowing upwards, its use gets ramped up a degree or two. The next new ability involved a psionic grappling hook of sorts. Now obviously the incorporation of something like this may not seem too exotic by video game standards, as other series like Zelda and Ratchet and Clank feature similar item-based abilities, but its mentally angled approach in Psychonauts by applying it to the thoughts of others brought out an extremely interesting quality, where when exploring someone else's mind you could manipulate their personas by using this power and linking various thought bubbles together. For instance, at one point you turned a person into a gambling addict by linking said action with thoughts of pleasure. So yeah, I just feel like it brought out an extra dimension to a relatively standard item/ability of most video games. Lastly, the final ability involved the protagonist conjuring an illustrated clone of himself, which could be used as a way to lure enemies away from you, or be utilized to enter small crevices, say a locked door, where with his flat body he could go in through a minor nook and unlock it from the inside, thus granting entrance to your main body. I view this as the least interesting of the new abilities, as it primarily exists as a reference to the television show Invader Zim, as the hero of this game voiced its protagonist, and vice versa. Zim's sidekick provides the vocal talent for the illustration here. Now, even though I call myself a fan of the TV series, I still view this ability as more of a cheap gimmick, though I do admit I enjoyed some of the projections lines and gags, such as mistaking himself as the real Raz. On to the characters. Now, what made the original cast of Psychonauts so great and memorable involved how the writers exaggerated the eccentricities of its already over-the-top crew, oftentimes in a way that resulted in poking fun at the nature of said personality. Again, the mind of an emotionless scientist consisted of a colorless cube floating in space. Now, with Psychonauts 2 covering more sensitive topics, I'll just say the writers handled matters more delicately, which to me produced absolutely bland and uninteresting characters. For instance, with the previously mentioned alcoholic, he happens to be romantically inclined towards men, and in regards to this aspect of his character, let's just say the writers considered this subject off limits, at least as something that could be played around with in his character, which to me just wastes so much potential, for instance as he happens to be the granduncle of the hero's love interest. That could be something fun to work with, maybe after saving him at the end of the level. He could comment something like, "In a few years you'll be just my type," or separately one ability of the game allows you to see through other people's eyes, which usually results in observing fictionalized perceptions of yourself, reflecting how they think about you, like in the first game at least, the love interest. His niece views you as an Adonis, while maybe the uncle perceives you as an adult version of that same Adonis. Anyway, because the writers couldn't exaggerate a significant chunk of his identity, he just rubs off as extremely dull. Besides that, he comes across as boring in another way, as he feels too pure, innocent, or flawless. Now some might argue that his alcoholism and his all-around grumpiness count as negatives, but in my eyes that actually serves to reinforce the image of his spotlessness, as he only fell into booze to mask his pain after the loss of a loved one, so less of a personality flaw and more of a narrative conflict, as essentially after he reunites with this long-lost person you have nothing else to work with to give him a distinct and interesting personality. Now I know some people might defend his characterization by saying him being into men suffices and crafts him into a good identity, but I simply can't agree. While still on the subject of the new cast members, I have to say they conceptually feel weaker than the original crew. Like a scientist modeled after Sigmund Freud obviously makes sense for a story about psychics, but in comparison a gardener and a Viking helmet-wearing musician just feel random in comparison. With the new peers of Raz, I'll just say they didn't receive enough time to be sound in a character development manner, but at the same time, except for maybe one or two of them, they lacked the strong personas by themselves to be good through identity alone. Like in the original Psychonauts, some characters received little to no screen time, but because they harbored a strong gimmick, such as one girl obsessing over aliens and making it her persona, it gave you something to latch on to even if she may lack some in-depth narrative. I even have to say Psychonauts 2 lessens some of the existing characters, for example in trying to display a more sensitive side of the protagonist's father. He just loses his strength and stern but understanding persona established at the end of the first game. With the boss battles, they all felt a bit too similar, and can be summed up as the protagonist standing on a platform in front of a giant multi-tendrilled monster, whereas the bosses of the first game definitely had a lot more variety to them, mixed sizes, different perspectives of camera angles, and even a wider range of powers needed to overcome them. Besides that, the final boss felt like a less interesting rehash of the first games. To close out, let me say this subject went on for too long, so I had to rush the ending, and if you want me to articulate in greater depths on this game, feel free to comment below. But to finish this off, I think the occupation of a psychonaut, as well as its organization, is something that should have remained unanswered, and been left to one's own imagination, as in trying to establish a history, purpose, or league of villains for them just sets itself up for failure, as it will always reach for something too far, and thus stretch itself too thin, whereas a plot of a boy going to a psychic summer camp to achieve his dreams can complete its own narrative and also manage to stay true to itself. To end this off, Psychonauts 2, even if it may have been used a few times too many, set itself up for a good joke, or if someone mentioned Camp Whispering Rock, the location of the first game, someone often said, "It feels like it's been 20 years since I've been there," which was basically the period between this and the release of the original game. Oh, and just to say this too, I 100%ed this game, so if you disagree with my overall stance, don't make the argument of me not giving this title a chance.
127. Dragon Ball Z, The Legacy of Goku 2. 126. Darkstalkers 3. 125. Super Mario Bros. 2. 124. The Legend of Zelda, The Minish Cap. 123. Final Fantasy VI. 122. Shadow Man. 121. Red Dead Redemption. 120. Brutal Legend. 119. Zone of the Enders, The Second Runner. 118. Dragon Ball Z, Budokai 2. 117. Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver. 116. Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty. 115. Silent Hill 2 2024. As purely a game, this remake surprisingly beats out its basis. It streamlined many awkwardly designed levels and puzzles, enhanced the combat of both the protagonist and his enemies, as well as reworked several scenarios around certain boss battles to make them feel all the more epic, which coincidentally fixed a common complaint of the original game, as these supposedly overpowered foes rubbed off more like standard enemies rather than as actual bosses. With all that said though, as a piece of art, the classification of what I personally consider the original work to belong to, the Silent Hill 2 remake fails to achieve anywhere near the same heights as its predecessor. An honest way of putting it would be by saying it killed the required mood, which not only happens to be the most important quality for the franchise, but also for the story that this individual game attempts to tell. I mention that last part because some might argue that a remake and/or new title don't need to perfectly follow its basis or home series to have value, which to an extent carries some truth. But in spite of that, the new changes clash with its own nature. Basically, it dropped the ball on the entire message that it as a work intended to speak. For example, in the original game, to reach the final boss entailed climbing several long square spiral staircases, going up from a very industrial basement to a roof with an ethereal backdrop. Now not only does this event build up tension, but in the context of the game symbolically represent the hero coming to terms with himself, essentially pulling himself out of the muck and achieving mental clarity. In all honesty, as a player, this segment felt very meditative too. Now this remake saw that artistic moment as nothing more than filler, and essentially skipped over it, as after a row or two, you'd find a ladder that directly took you to the very top. So in essence, the scene in the remake lost the vision of self-acceptance, a main theme of the story. Again, you can say it streamlined the process, especially for an impatient player, but it ultimately surrendered something more metaphysical and spiritual, the stuff that communicates with you on a more visceral level. Similarly, in the original title, a late-stage boss battle entailed combating an opponent chained to a bed and hung upside down from the ceiling, and in the fight, pretty much their only means of inflicting damage upon the player involved sending swarms of ravenous butterflies at you, essentially a slow-paced and solemn encounter. But now in the 2024 edition, a newly added phase has it detach from the ceiling and aggressively charge at you like a bull. Again, as a boss battle, I without a doubt deem this the more fun, action-packed and exciting experience, but once more, it killing the mood sacrifices something far greater. The things which in my opinion made the original so timeless and discussed 20 plus years later, basically adventured the path most other games wouldn't. What also mimics this past topic regards how the remake poorly translated the identities and visions behind the original cast into the new work. Now let me just say, I'm not trying to delve into politics or the culture war debate, but it's honestly kind of inevitable. First and foremost, it redesigned the female characters in an uglier fashion. Of course I understand the realism and the objectification argument, but regardless, it missed the entire point of their inclusion into the story. For example, one more youthful lady's purpose intended to seductively lure the protagonist away from the memory of his deceased wife, and with her new appearance, which in my opinion resembles a dumpy, middle-aged librarian attempting to look good for a blind date, she ain't tempting anyone, meaning she can't fulfill the role she plays. By the way, if the new game slightly altered her original narrative, something akin to acting more desperate or needy rather than trying to seduce the player, I could somewhat defend this change, but since the plot has her attempt to fit her past mold, it just feels off. Likewise, the identity behind the character of Eddie missed the mark in the remake too, or at least he lost his hook in the process. For example, even though the original release portrayed him as a psychopath too, it depicted him with a bit more sympathy, which made him a more compelling role in the long run. Like, it felt as if it crafted a scenario of a person caught in a conundrum of something like, I eat when I'm stressed, but I'm stressed because I eat, so it more felt like aspects out of his control pushed him over the brink, whereas his newfound image shows him as nothing more than an unapologetic, disgusting fat slob. For instance, the game reworked a scene of him formerly eating pizza to him now messily gulping down buttery popcorn, and it dirtying up his hands, concluding with him wiping it all over his shirt. Not to spoil his fate, but in the original game you could kind of feel bad for him with what happened. The story itself through the addition of a boss battle implies that you should, but with his more crude portrayal in the remake, it more feels like he deserved what would befall him. So anyway, it rubs off like Silent Hill 2 2024 dulled the cast down a bit. Petty as this may sound, one minor alteration to the first scuffle against the iconic Pyramid Head irked me a bit too, where the noise of a siren draws him away, and he just exits through a door, whereas the original 2001 edition had him walk down a flight of underwater stairs and presumably open a submerged door, causing the reservoir to disperse, thus allowing you to later exit. Admittedly, the old way lengthened the segment longer than need be, but its removal lost some of the world's mysticism in the process. As with it, Pyramid Head appeared more abnormal, and its existence supplemented the symbolism of water in the story, essentially acting as a metaphor for suppressing secrets. Honestly, I kind of wish the remake would have met in the middle ground by keeping the scene, but shortening it. Even though this past topic concerned how the remake cut the fat and truncated the prolonged scenes of the original game, in its own strange way it still seemed just as padded or bloated as before, if not more so. Like on the internet you can find playthroughs of this title twice as long as the original one, which kind of contradicts my narrative. But on that note, I'll just say the greater emphasis on combat exchanged one monotony for another. The build up to the bosses shortened, but the actual fights against them lengthened. Real quick, I wish to include that the music didn't mesh as well in the remake as it did in the original version, even if some of the songs remained unaltered. Part of this stems from the enhanced graphics not jiving with the original soundtrack, as realistic visuals almost innately clash with more atmospheric, if not hazy music from a title that released 2 decades plus earlier. Not to mention how some new remixes didn't sound anywhere near as instrumentally captivating as the original material. With that said, I almost feel dirty discussing this subject, since I view the soundtrack of the original Silent Hill 2 as one of Videogames' finest, so to me at least it almost felt too unfair a comparison, since it had to compete against an unwinnable foe. After all my ranting, I acknowledge that I may sound like I hate this title, but I truly don't. And with that said, I briefly want to discuss some positives. For instance, I actually preferred the remake's version of the apartment complex dungeon to the original, as I felt like it compartmentalized all the individual rooms in a much more consumable fashion. For example, one puzzle that many deemed too random and poorly connected pertained to a segment of where you had to drop a pack of soda down a clogged garbage chute to acquire a stuck key. Now, in the context of the game, drinks act as a health recovery item, so the arbitrary idea of wasting a pack of them to clear out a drain seems unlikely, which might result in a player not knowing how to progress onwards even if they already have the conduit to solve it. Now the remake made the answer to this conundrum way more evident, as you found the solution in the same room as the chute, and after picking up the pack, the camera panned over to the object for what they needed to be used on. So basically the 2024 version cleared up the frustrations of a commonly misunderstood, and possibly progress-halting puzzle of its predecessor. Next, even though I've previously defended long drawn-out hallways in regards to this series, I felt like it occurred too early, in the more physically driven first parts of the original game, so this remake shortening these passages as well as compressing the sizes of their respective rooms improved the overall pacing of this area. Likewise, the welcomed new mechanic of being able to leap over open window ledges had not only been put to good use in the apartment complex, but the rest of the game as well, as it allowed you to enter more previously unventured buildings, as well as create a few shortcuts by being able to go through rooms, instead of having to walk around them. I should also mention how the reimagining of the boss known as the Abstract Daddy left a far greater impression than its original variant, as it could pursue you through the hallways of the labyrinth area, and even break through walls, all of which shaped it into a much more formidable and powerful foe. Likewise, the omission of its clone counterparts in the later hotel area made this segment seem all the more significant, I actually addressed its reappearance as a grievance of mine against the original game, so it actually corrected something that I disliked about the original game. On the subject of improving enemies, the upgraded AI not only made some foes more interesting, but also enhanced the horror element of this game. For example, in the original game, I disliked that some opponents felt too similar in battle, and this reimagining of their abilities/movements made them feel more unique here, as the mannequin creature could now hide and disguise itself. Like it could crawl under a desk or intentionally mask itself from the player's view to wait for the proper time to attack, which in and of itself resulted in some well-earned jump scares, and that unpredictability enhances the ambience of a survival horror-themed game.
What also highly impressed me about the remake revolved around how it applied an interesting spin to old items from the original game that might be construed as ultimately pointless. For example, in both versions, the first weapon you receive at the beginning of the story happens to be a wooden plank to beat down enemies. Now in the original game, once you attain the much stronger iron pipe, the former becomes just a pointless inventory space filler, but the 2024 title of the same name gave a gripping final use to the plank, where after a chase sequence the protagonist uses it to bar shut a door holding back monsters, so besides clearing inventory space, this action makes this item feel more relevant to the story. Secondly, a similar case occurred with Pyramid Head's giant knife, as in the first game it serves as an optional weapon, but too impractical to ever utilize, but in the remake the protagonist has to use it to break open a passageway to the next area, so this too bestowed greater importance to a relatively unnecessary item, besides that too it now fulfilled an actual purpose, since to progress onwards you actually had to use it.
Of another matter, exchanging the encounter with Eddie at the bowling alley for a movie theater, to me at least came off as a worthy trade-off, as it put to good use the equipment of the studio, especially since it involved a pursuit segment. I'll just say projectors work wonders in this scene. In all honesty, I'm not calling it better than the original locale, but I at least view it as comparable, if not equal. On top of all that, it allowed for interesting callbacks to the original title, as you could still return to the bowling alley, but this time with a photograph referencing an iconic line. By the way, similar picture throwbacks to other altered segments recur through the story, so in a way it's an enjoyable aspect that longtime fans can enjoy as well. Lastly, I enjoyed this game for something other than its content, as it essentially helped me to relive the original game, as admittedly since I hadn't played this title in years, some strong qualities had been completely forgotten by me, and replaying those reimagined levels reminded me of them, such as how the hotel level included a segment where you dropped all your held items, leaving you defenseless to explore a new area. So an otherwise extremely creative situation had totally slipped from my memory. Overall, even though I have my complaints, the Silent Hill 2 remake is not a bad game. In fact, I view it as a welcomed reimagining to the franchise, and the only reason it may have sounded weak stems from the fact that it's forever tied to an indomitable legend of the genre. 114. ASX.
What initially intrigued me about this title regarded how I heard multiple people refer to this game as a story where every conspiracy theory proves true, and that concept alone fascinated me. But ultimately that aspect ended up pushed to the side by something that I found infinitely more interesting: its game design. Now, this title follows the more modern approach of tackling levels in video games, where you might have multiple methods of completing the same objective, but what makes this all the more unique a take regards how it ties into the RPG system of this game. For reference, you can spend the game's in-world currency on improving the skills of the protagonist, including computer hacking, lockpicking, or mastery over various weapon types, and strangely enough swimming too. Getting back to the point, let's just say you have to enter a guarded building. One approach might just be slaughtering all the watchmen till you find the one that has a key. Alternatively, if you invested in the lockpicking skill, you can sneak inside without having to kill anyone by simply just picking the lock. Likewise, if your hacking abilities are up to snuff, you can find the key code hidden in the email account of a nearby computer. And finally, if you investigate the environment a little, you might stumble upon something like an obscured ventilation system that takes you directly inside. Anyway, I thoroughly enjoyed this approach and found it mentally stimulating. Admittedly, in this aspect it might not be on the same level as say something like Hitman Blood Money, but for an older game it definitely impresses. I will say unupgraded weapon skills come off as a bit too shaky, like to the point that this supposedly trained secret agent has a less steady aim than a random person off the street. Obviously it beats the point of the system's inclusion if he starts off as a master, but I feel the debuff a tad bit too excessive. On a similar note, I should also mention how Deus Ex also allows for a non-lethal approach to completing objectives too, like you can also use tranquilizer darts or a stun baton to incapacitate foes. Now it may not be as robust a system as the skill-based completion methods, but it does add some depth to the game, especially since some characters acknowledge your kill count. For that reason alone, I also want to say how this game feels more modern, as many more contemporary titles like The Witcher 3 or Baldur's Gate 3 employ such practices, again with Deus Ex, maybe not to the same degree as its future counterparts, but its inclusion here seems impressive nonetheless. Likewise, I should also mention how some of your actions can influence the events of the story. Like if you neglect to eliminate a certain boss during an early encounter, they'll appear again at a later point to strike you down, or if in a certain mission you aid someone defending themselves from a criminal, causes a relative of theirs to lose respect for them, provoking them to run away, resulting in their absence during future revisits to this area, but appearing in a near-end game level. Again, an aspect like this felt very uncommon in titles of this period. With all that said though, even though some qualities of this game rub off as up to date, others feel outdated even for its time. Like even though this technically released during the era of the PS2, it can definitely come off like an older Nintendo 64 title, like I'd honestly say Perfect Dark handled several things better. By the way, for those saying generations don't apply to PC games, this did release on the PlayStation 2 as well. Going a bit off topic, one of the reasons for why this title has been in more public discourse lately regards how it indirectly predicted the future. One being the notable absence of the World Trade Center in the skyline during the New York levels of the game. Just for your information, this released in the year 2000. Likewise, a plot point of the story involves a shady organization bioengineering a virus of which they already have a cure for, in order to make the world submit to them. On another note, the idea of a surveillance state using AI to monitor everyone plays into the story as well. To avoid controversy, I'll just leave these plot points at that, and let you all come to your own conclusions. Regarding the conspiracy theory aspects of this game, they in my opinion seemed kind of underwhelming, though admittedly it likely stemmed from raised expectations. For instance, one briefly appearing character discussed a certain banking-related family and followed up by mentioning how the corporate tax rate significantly lowered from what it was during the 50s, which implies some organization took control over the government. With that first statement, I don't know anything about it, and if I did, I'd downplay it, which I might be doing, but regarding the latter, you can easily throw a wrench into that argument by just saying it slowly returned back to what it was prior to World War II. So again, to me this aspect didn't come across as all that groundbreaking. I acknowledge this will sound paradoxical, but I think the game took itself too seriously to have fun with this practice, yet I don't think it seemed informed enough to feel believable. I'm ending this with a spoiler, so if you don't want to hear this, skip to the next segment, but in Area 51 you fight a horde of nuclear-spitting gray aliens, and afterwards a worker states that he doesn't know if they are bioengineered creatures, actual aliens, or clones of them grown on Earth, but even if they do possess hyper-advanced intelligence, because they never had the chance to sharpen their intellect, they express the wits of something barely beyond that of a monkey, and to me I just found that minor line of dialogue such an interesting concept, so much so that I researched into the lore of the series and found out that in the game's own universe, it explains that the government manufactured them to distract the public away from what they actually experimented on, which again is a lore and concept also created another subject that I found myself totally fascinated by in and of itself. So, on that note, I want to end by clarifying that I may have only experienced the surface layer of Deus Ex, and underneath, something that I'm totally currently unaware of, might have the hidden potential to significantly elevate my standing with this game.
113. Hyrule Warriors. 112. Pokémon Tournament DX. 111. Live Alive. 110. The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds. 109. Metroid Prime. 108. Fallout 3. 107. Super Mario Sunshine. 106. The Legend of Zelda: Echoes of Wisdom. 105. Soul Calibur 2. 104. Dragon Ball Z: Boo's Fury. 103. The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. 102. Final Fantasy VIII. 101. Earthworm Jim. 100. God of War 2. 99. Xenogears. 98. The Legend of Zelda. 97. Duke Nukem 3D. 96. Oddworld: Stranger's Wrath. 95. Silent Hill 4: The Room. 94. Little Big Planet. 93. Super Mario Galaxy. 92. The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. 91. The Witcher 3: Wild Hunt. After an endless number of Game of the Year awards, and even a respected gaming YouTuber claiming that this dethroned Ocarina of Time is his favorite game, which happens to have been and still be mine as well, The Witcher 3 quickly rose to the top of my video game backlog, but despite my enthusiasm, once I finally got my hands on this title, or at least maybe after a few dozen hours into the story, I'll just say it came nowhere near close to meeting my expectations. As a video game, I view this title as two sides of the same coin with The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild, very similar in terms of nature and their content, but in its own way I believe they correct and address each other's issues. For example, at an early point of The Witcher 3, I found myself in a canyon terrain, and to exit it required a lengthy walk around all the way back to the entrance, and during this I couldn't help but feel like I wished this had Breath of the Wild's climb up any wall mechanic. Likewise though, with the aforementioned Zelda title, I always felt that device cheapened locations and took away their significance. For instance, a favorite location of mine in The Witcher 3 happened to be a lighthouse with a withdrawn bridge, and the only means of entering it involved diving into an underwater crevice beneath the site and swimming upwards, whereby after climbing a ladder you could reach the main level and lower the bridge. Now with the inclusion of Breath of the Wild's mechanics, this location would not feel special at all, and just be another pointless area, as you could just glide over and scale the side of the tower to gain entrance, thus skipping the entire point of the venue, whereas with The Witcher 3's approach this lighthouse becomes more than just a piece of the setting, as gaining access to it actually means something. Between these titles, for its more anything goes style of gameplay, I view Breath of the Wild as the more fun one, but in spite of that I ultimately consider The Witcher 3 the superior of the two for better creating a sense of significance. Articulating on that notion, this quality not only applies to landscapes, but aspects like quests and story too, as many times in Breath of the Wild a quest often consists of something like, find 10 apples for this person, which you likely already possess, thus coming off as a bit pointless. Now I totally understand that one might argue that this doesn't waste your time, at least in the way that something like a fetch quest would, but in spite of that it still lacks a sense of accomplishment or just about anything to give it meaning. Now with the side quests of The Witcher 3, even if they may not alter the world, which they sometimes do, they usually somehow give off a greater sense of purpose. A typical mission abides by a pattern of investigate a crime scene or monster attack, follow a trail, somehow lure the beast or offender out, and then deal with them. Basically most of these involve a narrative of unraveling a mystery, which almost inherently provides at least some depth to them. Once in a while a task may even take it a step further, and ask a question of your morality. I'll just say sometimes in the world of The Witcher, humans might be the actual monsters. What I'm willing to accept as a potential weakness in The Witcher 3's style of quests would be how if you intend to do everything that the game has to offer, it becomes repetitive, which I will not deny. For the record, other than upgrading all the gear to Grandmaster level, and salvaging all the drop points off the coast of the Viking Isles, I 100%ed this game. Much as with Breath of the Wild, The Witcher 3 boasts a massive map, one that maybe, though not as to the same degree as its Zelda counterpart, I would call underdeveloped. For the record, I avoid the term empty as I think the trait can enhance elements such as the mood or ambience, whereas underdeveloped implies a lack of anything substantial. Anyway, the first time exploring the world will without a doubt seem like a worthwhile experience, but it will rapidly lose any value the more you become situated with the region. Switching gears, I regret to have to dive into the subject of the culture wars, but it ultimately becomes unavoidable concerning this subject. Now, before I even played the game, one of the most common complaints I heard coming from the mouths of the critics concerned how they felt the game objectified women,
primarily for a few bathhouse scenes, some romantic encounters, and a few minimally revealing downloadable content dresses that the female characters can wear. While after experiencing The Witcher 3, I find those statements utterly laughable.
And I would personally go so far as to claim the opposite is true. For example, the leading lady of the cast, Yennefer, openly treats men like her slaves. Slightly after the middle point of the story, the protagonist returns to his home base only to stumble upon her ordering everyone around and sending his friends on missions. Similarly, throughout the plot, she consistently uses the protagonist to her own ends. One admittedly cool time had him swim to the ocean floor for a purpose she wouldn't reveal, besides that she'll read his mind without permission, and in another instance she openly told him how to dress for a party, which to be fair in game he could refuse, but still just that idea alone cements her as the one objectifying others. Likewise, male characters who can be argued as objectifying women generally end up humiliated. One gets embarrassed during a kidnapping scene, another ends up a pauper or dead depending on a prior decision, and if through the player's own actions the protagonist attempts to romance two of the influencing women at once, he ends up undressed and shackled to a bed overnight. So The Witcher 3 practically makes a special effort to ridicule men who don't treat women equally. Besides all that too, the story often goes out of its way to portray women as capable leaders or powerful. For example, one major narrative concerning the technically male-dominated Viking region involves helping them to elect a new leader, and pretty much the implied canon conclusion has them pick a woman. I say that because choosing the other options results in you missing out on an upgrade required to achieve a 100% completion of the game, plus selecting the Queen route also grants you some additional allies during a pivotal battle of an endgame mission. I acknowledge I'm sounding like a broken record at this point, but in that skirmish the women look like more capable fighters than the men. The sword-wielding witchers barely manage against 5 opponents, while with their spells the female sorceresses wipe out entire platoons. Beyond that, 2 cutscenes from this quest further highlight this portrayal of women looking better than men in combat. For example, the secondary protagonist of the story, Ciri, when in danger gets bailed out by another woman, but in a later scene, she rescues a male witcher, whose strength has been claimed to rival the protagonist, from having his skull crushed in. Now I admit these cinematics looked visually cool, but to me it felt like it stole the limelight away from a character that desperately needed it, and instead gave it to a woman who has already had, or will have dozens of moments to shine. Anyway, I know these past few segments may sound like I'm debating the critics rather than discussing the game itself, but to me I also think these examples support an argument for why I contend that this title thematically seems too heavy-handed or cheesy at times, as well as how some narrative elements fail to live up to expectations. Continuing on with that last idea, I would also like to add that the titular villains, the Wild Hunt, disappoint too. Avoiding spoilers, I'll just say that the beginning of the game portrays them as this unstoppable, spectral army, but as the story progresses they start to appear more human, and not in a character development thematic way, but in an easily beatable sense. Likewise, another antagonist group, the Ladies of the Wood, experienced a similar fate, as they too received stellar build-up presenting them as forces of nature, who omnipotently monitor and control everything within their own swampy territory, during an early mission the protagonist along with a squad of soldiers stated something along the lines of, "If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead already," but in spite of this recognition, when nearing the end of the game you finally challenge them. They go down quite easily, and the person who made that claim later called the three of them weaker than a commander of the Wild Hunt, and handed them off as foes to his apprentice, who actually managed to best them all by herself. Essentially they end up reduced to the status of a side objective. Giving credit where credit is due, I'll admit that The Witcher 3 has great individual narratives, as again I really enjoyed the build-up and first appearances of the Ladies of the Wood, but ultimately I view the overarching story as weak and flimsy, because it becomes increasingly apparent that either poor communication between the writers left ending segments feeling disjointed and contradictory of the past, or simply that many conclusions had to be rushed, leaving them substantively deficient. What I also believe debilitated the plot at least to a certain degree pertained to its incorporation of RPG elements into the story, pretty much player input being able to influence how certain narratives played out. Like to me I think the creators having to take into account so many malleable circumstances prevented them from tying up everything into a nice knot at the end. Now I admit some moldable events do carry worth, such as the shock value from Kiara the Sorceress's bad ending, but ultimately I think for a game building upon an existing series, novels at that, I think an exact trajectory would serve the story better. Just to say this, I'm not against RPGs with totally malleable stories, but for them to work, I think they virtually need to be designed from the ground up, and with The Witcher 3 coming off 2 prior games as well as a book series it lacks the proper foundation. Next, let me say this might be an issue on my part rather than the game itself, but I kind of think The Witcher 3 wastes the fantasy world element of the setting. First let me say I have no experience with prior Witcher titles, and from research I think they better utilize this environment and or concept, but in this third entry, the story revolves too much around humans. So much so that it squanders the components that make a fantasy world thrive. For instance, elves exist in the world, but plot-wise them as a race contributed relatively nothing to the plot, essentially nothing beyond the save them from an angry mob side quest, or this guy happens to be a good blacksmith, which again barely constitutes anything. Likewise, dragons dwell in this realm too, but other than small ones they never appear in the story. Again, I acknowledge prior titles covered this subject, and maybe you can even say The Witcher 3 strove for a more human-driven narrative, but for me knowing they exist and the story not emphasizing just makes the world seem less imaginative. Likewise, I don't necessarily consider this inherently wrong or a weakness of the story, but to me I'm not a fan of the surrogate father narratives, and with this title employing such practice, it just feels cheesy to me. Returning to the Breath of the Wild comparison, I believe both titles suffered from a lack of variety in enemy types, but in this regard I view The Witcher 3 as the better of the two, primarily because the creatures inhabiting its world fulfill a greater purpose above being generic grunts. On that note, both of these titles possessed absolutely massive worlds that actually dwarfed the amount of activities in the game, which for a person who like myself essentially 100%ed the two of them, resulted in me viewing them as a bit bloated and lacking in substantive content. But with that said, I think The Witcher 3 kept my attention longer. Speaking of which, The Witcher 3 placing a greater emphasis on the stuff beneath the topography, elements like caves and underground ruins, make me see this world with more depth than its Zelda counterpart, hence why I think it wins in the setting department. Now I will say in the category of physics, Breath of the Wild wins. I'll just state that The Witcher 3 has unapologetically bad fall damage plaguing its gameplay. Plus, even though it would feel out of place here, I do think Breath of the Wild's glider made traversing a large-scale world more fun, as well as helped deal with extremely high-up areas. By happenstance, the 10-year anniversary of The Witcher 3's release occurred while I played it, again totally unplanned, but a cool coincidence nonetheless. On that note, I also wish to say I actually preferred the downloadable content to the main game, Heart of Stone being my favorite. Briefly interjecting this in too, with Gwent, it followed my typical trajectory of opinions regarding card games contained within video games, where at first I find it too complicated and hate it, but then once I come to understand the rules, it somehow ends up one of my favorite aspects of the game itself. For reference, this happened with Final Fantasy VIII's Triple Triad 2. Overall, I hate calling The Witcher 3 a disappointment, as I view it as a disservice to the game itself, but I can't deny it. Now once more, I acknowledge that I entered into this title with raised expectations, but without any other input whatsoever I still think my opinion would have been the same, as I view this title as something too massive and ambitious to even hold up its own weight, such as how the story didn't tie up loose ends well, a gigantic but undeveloped world, and I didn't mention this earlier, but even though the world did indeed feel populated, many of the NPCs looked too similar. Virtually all the character models for women on their shoulders shared the exact same location of a birthmark, which for a game of this generation just seems shoddy. So to put it bluntly, I don't even think The Witcher 3 lived up to its own inflated expectations. 90. Azura's Wrath. 89. Golden Sun. 88. Kunitsugami, Path of the Goddess. I've always enjoyed the tower defense genre of games, but at the same time I've always more mentally associated the style itself with cheap internet browser games that often just end up a wasteful time filler, but through its practice in this title, its application produces a more fruitful and productive experience. For example, even though in tower defense style games certain aspects like attaining more spending money, the unlocking/upgrading of more defensive units, or just visually being able to witness the quicker obliteration of waves of mindless drones might seem like a sense of progress, but in the end it usually proves only illusionary. Like for me, oftentimes it's somewhere around the 50th stage. You've pretty much seen everything the title has to offer, and it just starts to follow the redundant pattern of increasing the number of on-screen enemies. The same generally applies to the upgrades too, or after an enhancement or two they just fire the same thing over and over again, but more rapidly. Besides possessing an overall story, an easy way to create a legitimate sense of progress, another simple way in how this title counteracts the redundant impression of the genre revolves around how the defense machinations go beyond just protecting a stationary tower, and instead a moving woman trying to reach a specific endpoint, which forces you to have to frequently change tactics as the level progresses. Like at the start of an area, the spawning enemies might take a while to reach the lady that you shelter, or even only attack from one position, thus allowing you to go more on the offensive, while more towards the middle of the stage, other angles of incursion open up, and likewise foes may now spawn closer to the target, all of which will likely coerce you into assuming a defensive role. So, from a gameplay perspective, it feels like the actual levels themselves evolve over an area's course of events. This may only tie into the tower defense style games I previously played, but in this title, after placing a defensive unit, they can actually move around the battlefield too, which to me prevents the all too common impression of this genre feeling a bit too static. Again, I may not be the most knowledgeable person in regards to this field, but it at least elevates this title for me since it felt different from what I currently know. On to the story. Now the premise follows a priestess as she attempts to spiritually cleanse an impure mountain, and this too promotes a sense of progression, as visually you witness the map return to normalcy, and you the player serve as her personal guardian, which gives you a little more input on the battlefield, as you actually participate in the fight. I say that because some tower defense games, at least if you design too good a blockade, begin to feel disconnected to you as the player, as your units can win without you. In regards to the plot, what also provides a sense of advancement revolves around the toll this purification mission takes on the priestess, where in a shadow of the Colossus-like fashion, she degrades over time, where at the start of the journey, in camp segments between missions you'll witness her interact with animals and move about on her own, to by the conclusion barely being able to exit a tent by herself. What also adds a little spice and variety to the game pertains to how diverse the various levels of the story can be. One scenario has the protagonist incapacitated, forcing them to act as an armchair general. Another has no available supporting units, prompting the hero to act as the sole guard for the priestess. And one mission occurs atop a floating raft where enemies can bust off partitions of it, which if occurs results in less available space as well as the loss of allies that had been on the area. From that you can also deduce that environmentally levels can differ from each other too, which itself offers a diverse range of gameplay. One location takes place in a cavern, where in order to let your units fight, you have to light lanterns for them to see, and also a swampy area requires you to utilize your combat units as carpenters to construct stable bridges so your priestess can safely cross. For the record, the waters of this locale poison her, so she simply can't swim across to the next portion of land. Bosses mix up the gameplay too, as you'll face some airborne ones that might require archers or long-distance based units. A cave centipede capable of climbing walls can only take substantial damage in well-lit areas, and against a frog in a poisonous swamp locale, you can opt for the slow, but safe route and use long-distance fighters to avoid toxic pools. Or if you play more attentively, you can harness the quicker damage-dealing melee combatants, but also have to focus on the poisonous liquids its body produces. Anyway, I have to say all the levels feel unique and almost never come off as repetitive. In all fairness, I must acknowledge that this Capcom title suffers from a common trope of its developers, by having to face a boss rush segment in the build-up to the final level, and with refighting old bosses. I cannot deny that this practice rubs off as repetitive, but once more I reiterate that the individual levels themselves feel distinct from one another. Lastly, the game employing an art style based on Buddhism and Asian mythology establish a great and distinct look for this title. With that said though, its stringency to the aesthetic prevented me from telling the difference between certain ability-granting talismans in battle, as they happen to be written exclusively in Japanese kanji, so during levels where I utilized them, I had to go completely off of the memory of their order to know their effects. Overall, Path of the Goddess raised what might normally be perceived as just a cheap genre for internet games into the realm of a AAA experience, and also simultaneously breathe fresh air into otherwise wearied practices. 87. Fighters Megamix. No one probably minds, but I feel an obligation to mention this anyway, and it's that I played this title back in 2024, right after the cutoff point for my first list, which in the long run quite frankly doesn't matter, but if let's just say I don't sound as articulate here as for other entries on this updated version, this fact might account for why. Anyway, on to why I enjoyed this game. To start off, in a weird way you can essentially call Fighters Megamix Sega's Super Smash Bros., as it serves as a crossover fighting game for all the pre-New Millennium franchises under this corporation's video game umbrella. But what may surprise everyone regards how they completely sidelined their main company mascot, Sonic, in favor of two other series in Virtua Fighter and Fighting Vipers, both of which happen to be pure fighting games. Now, not to say this title lacks Sonic representation, but it picked two incredibly obscure references in Bark the Polar Bear and Bean the Dynamite, neither of which probably even break into the tertiary level of the cast, but in its own weird way I think this worked to the benefit of the actual game, as the inclusion of major Sonic characters would have likely shifted this away from a serious fighting game to more of a novelty-based stunt, i.e. something akin to becoming a gimmicky, Sonic's fighting game rather than a fighting game of its own. As a fighter, what really won me over about this title regarded how it just felt like a pure barroom brawl, action-packed electric music playing in the background, armors being knocked off of combatants, and ending a match with a heavy blow could send your opponent through the peripheries of enclosed rings. With the actual battles of the game, they implemented a Z-axis and went full 3D, which in all honesty is a style I generally prefer over 2D ones. I'd personally describe it as a bit of a prototype model for the future Dragon Ball Z Budokai series. With the controls, I'd say it found the right balance, not brain-dead easy, but not too much of a learning curve to perform the more impressive techniques and feats, which I view as the better option for a crossover game where the characters will presumably serve as the main selling point. Speaking for myself, I probably played this at the right time, as I had just finished cranking out a demanding, time-sensitive video a few days prior, so something more casual hit the spot. Believe it or not, the night before, I basically had to drop Virtua Fighter 2 in part due to its more complex mechanics, so that also likely influenced my decision also. For the record, around that period I tried to improve my knowledge on the Sega Saturn, a system I'm not all well read on. Returning to the roster, it possessed a sizable cast. I believe everyone from Virtua Fighter appeared, and I wouldn't be surprised if it contained everyone from Vipers too. I also have to say that the selections from the Sonic franchise meshed well too, as them not being the mainstays didn't draw away from the inherent grit of the matches. Once more I'll reiterate that the appearance of the more popular Sonic characters would have made this feel more friendly than it should be, thus less of a barroom brawler. In saying that though, with the characters of the franchise they did decide to include here, from their depictions alone already organically give off more pugilistic vibes, so their additions all the more work into the nature of the game without seeming out of place. One other guest of note happens to be Virtua Cop 2's Janet, who happened to be a star of the exact game I played during the rendering/uploading of the aforementioned video I discussed earlier, the one that made me yearn for something like Fighter's Megamix. Anyway, it was kind of neat to see a recently learned of face present in a crossover game like this. Now, even though this title came with a lot of grit, it also had its fair share of levity, which made it feel a little exotic. Like joke, members of the roster included chibi versions of the Virtua Fighters, which referenced its more kid-friendly spin-off, a standing on two tires, anthropomorphic car representing the Daytona USA Racing Series, and an aggressive palm tree, the symbol of the developer's studio. It's hard to put into words, but none of them felt out of place here. Lastly, I liked how this title tackled arcade mode, where instead of squaring off against the same adversaries each and every time, you instead could pick a thematic course of opponents, some of which included just the cast of each respective series, only the girls of the roster, the muscleheads, the more intelligent combatants, or even all the unlockable characters. What made this all the more an interesting move regarded how completing a specific course earned you a new fighter emblematic of the respective theme. Tenderizing the muscleheads unleashed the hulking polar bear bark, and besting the ladies lineup landed the female police officer Janet into the selection screen. To end this off, I'm slightly hesitant to speak this, but I think this title might be my favorite game exclusive to a Sega console. Admittedly, even though the Genesis happens to have been my first video game console, I'm not exactly the most knowledgeable on the subject, but for now at least I view Fighter's Megamix as my favorite game from a Sega system. 86. Devil May Cry. 85. Killer Instinct 2013. I first learned of this title either nearing the end of my hiatus from the medium of video games, or shortly after I returned, as I distinctly remember discovering the reboot of the Killer Instinct franchise from a fun fact video showcasing the funniest costumes in video games, where I witnessed a Viking-themed Conan the Barbarian dueling it out with a velociraptor sporting a cheerleader outfit, and that immediately sold me, both on the characters and the humor. But after looking into this title, I came to learn of something called season passes, which these two cast members could only be accessible from after purchasing, and that setback immediately paused all my interest in this brawler. For reference, part of the reason for why I temporarily abandoned the medium itself stems from my disdain for downloadable content, or simply just not adding everything to the disc. Now, much to my surprise, when in 2025 I received a free 3-month trial to Game Pass, and saw a complete version of Killer Instinct 2013, let's just say I immediately clicked the download button. To be fair, my enthusiasm for this title had also waned a little after trying out Killer Instinct Gold on the N64, which for some reason lacked the raptor fighter I desired to play as, and the Conan Viking lookalike possessed a less interesting appearance than here, plus the difficulty seemed a bit steep, but anyway, that misstep curbed my expectations for its follow-up reboot. Without further delay, I'll state Killer Instinct 2013 quelled my worries and remedied my issues with Gold. For example, my version contained every character that had previously appeared in the franchise. Like when I first learned that Gold cut the Raptor Fighter, I considered switching over to the earlier Super Nintendo game, which had it, but when I found out that the Viking Conan hadn't debuted yet, I ultimately stuck with the Nintendo 64 version, since I already had it, but regardless, that left me disappointed. But with the 2013 version featuring both characters, I feel as if I received the best of both titles. In all likelihood, its predecessor's deficiencies probably resulted in me subconsciously giving this game extra credit. Articulating on the roster, from sheer uniqueness alone, Killer Instinct 2013 contains one of my favorite cast of combatants from any fighting game, everything from ancient mummies to futuristic android CEOs, or an unaging golem to a long-since perished Japanese spirit. One observation while playing this game provoked a realization in my mind between various fighting game franchises, or with Western fighting games, of what Killer Instinct belongs to. They usually thrive with the conceiving of male characters, but often falter with females, where they end up bland and boring, whereas with Japanese fighting games I find the opposite to be true, where the men feel generic, often rip-offs of the cast of Street Fighter, and with women usually coming off as more developed, unique and memorable. Concerning that, I'll just say the Dead or Alive franchise comes to mind. From what you've likely deduced thus far, I view the lady fighters of Killer Instinct, or at least with the humanoid ones, as a bit indistinct and vapid. To say this as well, I enjoyed the inclusion of the Japanese ghost gal as a playable character, but I view giving her a sword-wielding second slot on the roster a bit unnecessary. So even though I perceive her as a better addition to the cast, I still think she created an overall issue among the ladies. To briefly cover the male members of the cast, I'll say Thunder happens to be my favorite depiction of a Native American in a fighting game. Face paint and his sharp animal teeth necklace make him look war-ready and vicious, his swollen muscles and tall build portray him as an unstoppable looming over the horizon figure, and his painted white forearms coupled with his electrically charged dual axes present him as if he emits an icy aura of energy. Switching gears, one really cool thing that caught me off guard revolved around how I unintentionally initiated this game's equivalent of a stage fatality, or in the Japanese Ghost Girl's homestage I accidentally ended off an ultra combo, this title's version of a Mortal Kombat fatality, with a kick instead of a punch, which resulted in spectral hands rising up out of their graves to drag my opponent into the underworld. Stage fatalities alone already come off as cool in general, but unknowingly producing one, especially one of the more over-the-top ones at that, made this moment all the more unforgettable for me.
Since sometimes fans of fighting games like to hear about who you main, or in other words played as the most, I thought I'd mention that the Fun Facts video I saw all those years ago turned out to be prophetic, as the cheerleading raptor, albeit without the costume this time around, happened to be the character I played best as. With Tusk, who I previously referred to as the Viking-themed Conan, I struggled at first with him since because he wields a sword he moves weirdly, but I eventually got decent with him. By the way, when I say I play best as a character, at least with Killer Instinct, I mean it, as I gave everyone a sizable chance. I beat arcade mode with every eligible character, completed survival mode at least up to 10 rounds for every fighter, and played at minimum 5 versus matches with everyone, so I'm not kidding when I called the Raptor my best fighter. For the record, I have so much experience with this title, because you receive daily rewards for playing, and I pretty much logged in every day for 2.5 of the 3-month subscription I had.
Overall, as a fighting game I view it as on par with my favorite Mortal Kombat entry, Mortal Kombat 2011. I've gone back and forth deciding which one I consider the better of the two, but I ultimately lean towards Mortal Kombat, since I prefer its story mode to Killer Instinct's, which seems less narrative-driven and more akin to a roguelike adventure system. Anyway, my rankings between these two reboot titles will probably fluctuate up until the day I finally publish this list. 84. Mortal Kombat 2011. 83. Golden Sun, The Lost Age. 82. Resistance 2. 81. Hitman, Contracts. 80. Grand Theft Auto 4. 79. Infamous. 78. Prototype. 77. The Incredible Hulk, Ultimate Destruction. 76. Castlevania, Symphony of the Night. 75. Uncharted 2, Among Thieves. 74. Chrono Trigger. 73. Super Smash Bros. 72. Ratchet and Clank Future, A Crack in Time. 71. Fatal Frame, Maiden of Blackwater. 70. Pikmin 3. 69. Shadow of the Colossus. 68. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. 67. Dragon Ball Z: Budokai Tenkaichi 2. 66. Kinnikuman Muscle Grand Prix 2. 65. Yu-Gi-Oh! The Falsebound Kingdom. 64. Goemon's Great Adventure. 63. Sly 2: Band of Thieves. 62. Castlevania: Legacy of Darkness. 61. Oddworld: Munch's Odyssey. 60. Super Smash Bros. Brawl. 59. Jak 3. 58. Uncharted: Drake's Fortune. 57. Baldur's Gate 3.
Before I begin, an aspect that highly elevated the experience of this game for me pertained to how beforehand I had little to no knowledge of the Dungeons & Dragons universe, the franchise of what this series bases itself off of, which in just playing this title, felt educational, and it taught me the origins of tropes that I essentially believed to have always existed. As a keen player of JRPGs, I just assumed that something like the well-known enemy of the Mimic Chest just began in the genre itself, and not that it had borrowed its likeness from somewhere else, a completely different medium at that. Similarly, I knew of the Mind Flayer race, but I had no idea that it came from Dungeons & Dragons. The same applies to the Sahuagin fish people too, and for me simply learning where all these creatures began, outright crafted this title into a worthwhile and informative experience, independent of the game itself. Speaking tangentially about the image of Baldur's Gate 3 again, it happened to have been released the same year as The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, a game which I have yet to play, but in spite of that I know much of its actual content, and from long plays in various YouTube videos I picked up on several weaknesses, one of them being how empty the newly added area known as the Depths could feel. Now with pretty much any media I take great enjoyment in reflecting about how I could fix the issues I have with them, and with Tears of the Kingdom I concluded that it needed a new race or two, exclusive to the underground realm. Now even though I had some ideas I struggled to muster up an interesting one. Moles or worms seemed too obvious, likewise counterparts to existing races present on the surface just struck me as lazy, but in saying all that, I think Baldur's Gate 3, or I guess, technically Dungeons & Dragons, found a perfect solution to remedy this issue, or in its underground area, known as the Underdark, dwelled a species of telepathic mushroom people, one of them being able to produce spores capable of manipulating the dead. Just from answering my racial conundrum alone, substantially raised the stocks of Baldur's Gate 3 in my eyes, but also providing this species a solid culture, a set of exclusive powers, and even a greater identity to them went far beyond my expectations, so again its actual content felt like it hit me external of the game itself. Onto the actual material of Baldur's Gate 3. Now as a video game I've honestly played nothing like it, admittedly me disregarding the medium of computer games, as well as series like Diablo likely contributed to my ignorance, but regardless this still seemed totally unique to me. I say all this because with video games I generally rate newfound experiences highly, and from that trend has always sprung a wonder of mine questioning if I'd rank the work as positively if I had more grounding with stuff cut from a similar cloth. I've digressed enough. Fundamentally, this title ties together components of turn-based RPGs with elements of strategy games, which work fabulously as a combination. For instance, during a turn you not only control how a character attacks, or what items they might harness, but also command their movement, which really brings out an extra dimension to the gameplay. Like with a bow and arrow, you can strike them from afar, and afterwards take cover behind a wall, so in the following round, an opponent can't hit you back, even if they too hold a long-distance weapon. Beyond that, you can use your turn to manipulate the positioning of your foes as well, like a physically strong companion can throw an enemy into another, damaging them both in the process, then afterwards perform a large-scale magical attack to hit them once more. Similar concepts involve terrain/hazards and weather effects, like if you cast an ice spell you might freeze the floor causing your foes or allies to trip mid-battle. Likewise, let's just say you might be scuffling with an opponent in a sodden area. Well, if you unleash an electrical ability, you can shock the floor and zap everyone in contact with the watery substance. Now individually I've seen many of these qualities implemented into other games before, but never all together, or even as intricately as Baldur's Gate 3. The closest thing I could think of would be something like the Hitman franchise, as in its gameplay, you could do something like overflow a faucet, which might lure a target over, and you could in some manner electrocute them. But anyway, such intricacy just works extremely well with a RPG with real-time strategy elements. While still on the topic of battles, what kind of indirectly creates a low point of the game for me revolves around how this title features a surprisingly small amount of combat-based situations, and what bothers me about that aspect regards how, at least during a single playthrough, it feels like you have a relatively minimal amount of time to experiment with all the abilities and builds of the game. And what makes this all the more substantial pertains to the rather large quantity of available party members, as it can easily result in feeling like you missed out on the entire point behind a character. Party banter, for example, as certain lines of dialogue only occur when specific members reside in the group together, and because of that you can easily miss out on sides of their character, and having to share the limelight between a unit of 4, really only 3 if you designed your own custom character, among a large cast will almost definitely leave you feeling like you missed out on something interesting, though to be fair I guess too much available content serves as the superior option to not enough. Now I understand the argument that you can just replay the game again, but when its runtime can easily surpass 100 hours, it just becomes unfeasible. Sticking with the party members, I'll say other than the warlock by the name of Will, whose good nature writes him as a bit generic and bland, I enjoyed the base cast, but almost every later acquired party member seems superfluous, which again adds fuel to the flame of too much content leaving characters underdeveloped. This becomes all the more apparent from the fact that after their recruitment, the majority of them lack any substantial narrative, or at least other than one of them who has a hand in the enrollment of the final potential party member. Returning to the base cast, they all had some kind of narrative behind their identity to establish depth in their person, something that couldn't be resolved in a simple mission or two, really not until nearing the end of the actual story, and that really helped it feel like they all grew and developed as characters over time. I pretty much enjoyed all these characters' conflicts, but I feel that a few of them ended abruptly, especially after long build-up. Switching gears, I acknowledge this may sound like a weird praise, but I took delight in the fact that in the customization menu, when you remove a character's armor it actually lets everything hang out in the open. I mention this because I always found it silly in other games, Fallout 3 in particular, when let's say you take off the barbarian armor, which torso-wise, consists of nothing more than shoulder pads and a sash, somehow results in you now wearing a not present before undershirt. So, with Baldur's Gate 3 letting characters show some skin, just feels more honest and authentic. Atmospherically, I view Baldur's Gate 3 as one of the best games in a long time. Some of the best areas include the House of Hope, the Astral Plane, a vampire's dungeon, the undersea prison of the Iron Throne, and the illuminated depths of the Underdark. Lastly, I view the game's romance/dating mechanic as a bit of a mixed bag. For starters, I wish you could toggle off certain persuasions of romantic options. For reference, I played as a male character interested in women, but for whatever reason I constantly got hit on by other men, and many times it came out of nowhere too, like just when you think you're about to have a casual conversation with someone, they suddenly start to get a little too close. Anyway, I'm not necessarily opposed to the inclusion of this type of content, as I acknowledge some people might enjoy it themselves, but I just wish it wasn't as in your face. On that note, I even have to say that, for some reason or other, the women played way harder to get than the men. Now characterization-wise I understand that such actions sometimes might mesh well with their established personalities, but I just wish you could toggle off some switch, just so every time you make a decision that a companion agrees with, they wouldn't try to get into your pants. To say this too, in my opinion it comes off as a bit weird how every single romanceable option can somehow be attracted to both men and women. It portrays them as a bit too much like blank slates. For the hedonistic vampire of the group it works, but applying it to everyone else just goes a bit too far. On that note, crazy romance options did produce one funny moment for me, more so externally though. For example, I had already shacked up with the goth half-elf, Shadowheart, then in spite of that, a muscular male druid proposed to me, to which I declined, citing my existing relationship, resulting in him claiming to be okay with a throuple, and even though I turned him down again, he persisted a time or two more before accepting rejection, so basically he tried to invite himself into the relationship, and pretend like I asked him for a 3-person couple instead of the other way around. During this moment I found it annoying, but upon more reflection it became hilarious. I actually joked about this with family members, and we came up with a scenario of Shadowheart dumping my character over this druid's incessant behavior, and in response he would say something like, "She just couldn't understand your way of life, but you still have me." Anyway, even though this became obnoxious, it ended up obnoxious in an endearing way by the conclusion. To end this off, Baldur's Gate 3 highly impressed me with its sheer attention to detail, and I honestly wish it could have been my game of the year, but unfortunately it released during the same period as the masterpiece of Corn Kid 64, as well as another soon-to-be-mentioned work. But anyway, in its own weird way I think its greatest strength held it back from taking the top seat, as the pure simplicity of something like Corn Kid 64 prevented it from having any flaws, while the admirable complexity of Baldur's Gate 3 rendered errors inevitable, hence why I can't view it as perfect, but regardless, though, it still blows other titles that commonly won Game of the Year awards, such as The Witcher 3 and Breath of the Wild, out of the water.
56. Katamari Damacy. 55. Diddy Kong Racing. 54. Grand Theft Auto, San Andreas. 53. Dead or Alive 2, Hardcore. 52. Bully. 51. Conker's Bad Fur Day. 50. Sin and Punishment. 49. Fire Emblem, Genealogy of the Holy War. 48. Pokemon Ruby. 47. Stalker 2, Heart of Chernobyl. Before I begin, let me just state that even though I may have seen the 1979 Tarkovsky film of Stalker, I had no relationship to the video game series of the same name before experiencing this title. I say that because one of the common critiques of this game pertained to how it deviated from the established continuity, such as changing the natures of certain established enemy types, and even existing characters having radical personality shifts from their original depictions. Regarding the former, I can't really comment, but I can at least say it didn't impact my view of the game, and with the latter I think some people with this opinion either didn't play enough into the story, or a few aspects might have gone over their heads, neither of which I can't necessarily blame them for, as the plot can be quite complex to understand, and some important factors only become known if you pursue specific narratives, a few of which can be locked out if you make certain choices throughout the game. But anyway, I'd argue that Stalker 2 provided subtle cues on the newfound temperaments of older characters. For example, one former protagonist known for his logic and cunning had fallen into paranoia and irrationality, and another went from a silent and stoic disposition to being hyper-expressive and never shutting up. While both of them have rationale behind their new characterizations, for example in the irradiated world of Stalker, its inhabitants can come across supernatural objects known as artifacts, which can allow their owner to perform superhuman feats, but generally at a cost. Like in-game, the weird nut artifact prevents the bleeding status effect, but in turn slows healing. Well, one of the characters that received complaints for his changing in the pre-story of the game stumbled upon a super artifact, which has been implied to have almost completely reworked his brain chemistry, hence why he acts like a different person. Similarly with the other remolded member of the cast, who had been canonically captured at the end of his title, underwent a certain procedure, and had something mind-altering implanted in his head, so overall excuses existed for their modified personalities. Admittedly, maybe if I had a prior connection with this franchise, what befell these characters would have bothered me, or I would have deemed their fates beneath them, but because I lacked that attachment I can easily write it off. To be fair, this next subject also convinces me that I would have likely accepted their outcomes even if I did possess a prior connection to this franchise, as a focal point of the series revolves around how unapologetic and harsh reality can be, even to the most experienced of people. Articulating on that topic, Stalker 2 provides little to no special privileges and benefits to the player that it wouldn't also grant to their opponents. In all honesty, I quite often found that when hunting enemies, they noticed me before I picked up on them, especially in the early game. Likewise, in terms of health, I'll say they could just as easily put me down as quickly as I could them, again especially in the early portions of the story. With non-human enemies this proves all the more true, where even basic grunts could be extreme bullet sponges, which actually resulted in many critics taking issue with said endurance. But to me, even if it may seem tedious or excessively burdensome, I can turn the blind eye to it, because it just blends so well with the established unforgiving nature of this game's world. Beyond all that, even the environment itself has its sights on you, as one wrong turn could land you in a nuclear hotspot, or supernatural traps referred to as anomalies lurk around every corner, one as simple as a near-invisible bubble that will rip you apart if entered. As with many modern open-world games, Stalker 2 harbors the luxury of a fast travel system, but to nowhere near as merciful a degree as others, where to engage in said time-saving mechanic costs in-game currency, and can only be initiated by conversing with specific people only inhabiting the main settlements of the world. So it exists, but it ain't exactly lenient. A cheesy defense of this practice would be by saying that it encourages the player to explore the world, visit random locations off in the distance, or try to find artifacts, but in all honesty I just think the developers stifled the process, just so that the idea of traveling would mesh better with the arduous and unforgiving nature of the setting. Obviously, it can come off as extremely annoying at times, but it adds to the experience. Similarly, Stalker 2 incorporates the encumbered status into the mechanics as well, and what makes matters more brutal regards how the best source of income generally concerns selling loot to vendors, so quite often you might find yourself having to traverse a vast wasteland weighed down and moving at a reduced pace just to maximize profits. To be fair, you can store loot in some Resident Evil style chests that magically, once an object is placed in, can be accessed from other locations, but just as with fast travel points, these chests can be far and few between. Again, an annoyance that enhances the themes of the game. Visually and fundamentally, this title possesses numerous similarities to the later entries of the Fallout franchise, an RPG with a first-person view, all while navigating an irradiated wasteland, except Stalker intentionally omits the more unrealistic elements, like after you complete a mission, you don't level up, improve as a fighter, or gain a skill point to enhance an ability, you just remain the same. Now, at first this felt unfulfilling, especially since I have experience with Fallout 3 as well as just with the medium of video games in general, but as it went on it just seemed more authentic. Like in the real world, it's not like if a soldier survives 10 skirmishes, he doesn't automatically become immortal or a super soldier, he stays the same, potentially even weakens from fatigue or cockiness. I know I sound like a broken record at this point, but this aspect just adds to the game's realism and unrelenting nature. Overall, when combined, these qualities just craft a strong identity for this title. Besides all that too, I should also say I found the game's realism refreshing in another way, as the human populace primarily consisted of grizzled and malnourished men, oftentimes missing a tooth or two, and not some pretty, pink-haired anime girl or bratty, purple-haired chick with a mohawk, which to me signifies that instead of viewing the battlefield as a mere playground, which has become all too common lately, it rather treats it with the seriousness that one should perceive it with. To not beat around the bush, one of the major criticisms of this game pertained to its glitches. Now, I'm not going to deny I faced some, but in all honesty, I endured more and worse ones in the decade-old plus Witcher 3. One less intrusive glitch involved a time when I explored a newly abandoned military outpost, where its former inhabitants, instead of being tucked away, had all accidentally spawned in one location together, forming an amorphous blob. Definitely a bug in the system, a funny one at that, but not game-breaking. This may or may not be considered a glitch, but at 2 times my save files malfunctioned, The first one were after an update the continue prompt at the opening screen didn't work, but reloading it manually did, which fixed the issue. Secondly, as I played during the transition into daylight savings my save files became out of order, like pressing continue would accidentally load an older save instead of the newest one. Again I easily remedied the situation by reloading manually, though I must confess that in the moment the thought of losing hours of progress frustrated me. Third, and the most severe of glitches, where objects could accidentally end up sent out of the world's bounds. For example, a psychic enemy could telepathically rip a weapon right out of your hands, which in doing so might result in it falling through the floor. For me, I actually reloaded because of this, since I lost one of my best firearms from this error. Another instance involved a tornado accidentally launching the corpse of a deceased man through the ground after a storm. Now the game intended for me to loot his body to find a note beginning a quest to find a specialty one-of-a-kind artifact. Luckily I already knew the importance of this segment and reloaded. Anyway, other than the clipping through the floor glitches, they really weren't all that bad, at least nothing end running. Now I must admit that I played Stalker 2 months after its release, so maybe I missed the worst of them, but regardless nothing hindered me from completely beating the entire game. Moving on, Stalker 2 possessed a strong cinematic quality, well-written characters, unique environments, and excellent cutscenes. For example, one theatrical character, who acted in a manner of an Errol Flynn hero, openly quoted Shakespeare and would give over-the-top monologues where he might occasionally writhe all over the floor. In story sought an impossible dream, and from those qualities alone I view this as an interesting concept for a character. As essentially a person who chased a delusional fantasy, practically lived like one himself. By the way, at a later point of the story he gave a near line-for-line speech taken from Hamlet, except exchanging names of certain roles within the play for cast members of this game, and to me this easily became one of the best and most memorable cutscenes of modern gaming. What also gave the story and its characters depth revolved around how all the opposing routes/decisions of the plot allowed for different perspectives of the same person, an example being between the two major factions of the game, Spark and the Ward. Like from the setup of the plot, you most likely will side with Spark, and view the man in charge of the Ward as an authoritarian brute, who crushes all opposition and seeks to limit freedom. But if you take the Ward route you'll see the human side of him, and learn of a man barely holding himself together after sacrificing all for his country and organization. In addition to that, seeing Spark from his perspective, they instead almost come across as lunatics playing with fire in a nuclear zone. Which if you played from their side isn't necessarily false either. So, again, it feels like the story and its cast have lots of layers to them. What might be the best aspect of this game pertains to its environment and its relative atmosphere. Now, a common complaint of many open-world titles regards how they often seem empty or too desolate, but that really works to the advantage of Stalker, as since the primary location of the plot resides on the abandoned outskirts of the Chernobyl disaster zone, the sense of a vast, sparsely populated nothingness bolsters the believability of the locale. Besides that, abandoned towns, overgrown foliage and dilapidated buildings add to the charm of the setting, but what overall solidified the world regards its supernatural occurrences. For example, near a nuclear power plant you can stumble upon a tornado of flames. In the north region of the lesser zone, you can find a hypnotic poppy field that lulls victims into an endless sleep. Deep within the burnt forest dwells a fog that gives people visions of the past, and close to the cement factory territory resides a ceased-built construction site, which if you attempt to climb will blur your eyesight and induce polyopia. I've been rambling for too long and I gotta rush to the conclusion. Anyway, if you listen to my prior breakdown of Shadow of the Colossus from my favorite games list video, I view Stalker 2 quite similarly, or because of its experimentality, in this case its intentional use of making everything more arduous than need be and strongly abiding by the practice, from concept alone and sheer uniqueness, it almost innately should receive a high score, but because it didn't obey the standard rubric, i.e. the time-saving quality of life conveniences, I can't consider it perfect, even if it heavily invested in aspects that are up my alley. Besides that too, I do question that since this title differs so much from everything else I've played, I kind of wonder if that blinded me from seeing some faults, like I wouldn't be surprised that if I had previously played the first Stalker game, the sequel wouldn't have seemed as special an experience to me. Regardless, though, I still argue this as one of the best video games of the decade thus far. 46. Pikmin 4. 45. Xenoblade Chronicles 2. 44. Palworld. My opinion of this title has wildly fluctuated, to say the least. For example, even before its debut, I quite enjoyed that something dared to challenge the dominance of Pokemon. Besides that too, from what I saw, the designs of its creatures, aptly known as pals, looked far better than anything its competitor had put out in generations. On top of that too, the name Palworld had a nice ring to it, since the taxonomy of its creatures derived from its title, as well as how from the definition of the word pal, stands as another way to say friend, which further reinforces the notion of a monster capturing game where people and animals alike have to coexist together. Now, once this title dropped, and my only experience of the game came through only Let's Plays of YouTubers, my opinion absolutely plummeted. As at first glance it looked like a creatively bankrupt cash grab, as most of its mechanics replicated what had been popular at the time, the movement and glide mechanics of Breath of the Wild, the crafting system of Minecraft, Elden Ring's off in the distance Giant Tree, as well as the Souls-like genre's mechanic of losing everything upon death, but above all else the capture mechanic of Pokemon. In all honesty, at the time, the only thing that seemed unique regarded how you could catch humans too, which in all fairness only came off as original, because other titles didn't wish to cross over into that controversial territory. Anyway, despite that negative impression, once I received a free 3 months to Game Pass, I decided to give this title a chance. At first, I basically agreed with my initial perception of what I saw on YouTube, being upfront. My less than positive stance actually further emboldened, as in general I find resource gathering and crafting mechanics in games rather mundane, but Palworld almost made the design seem worse, since instead of going to capture monsters, what I wanted to do, I instead had to sit back and collect the materials to make the spheres to capture them, which rubbed off as all the more tedious in the long run, almost like a cruel joke. Obviously, the concept of losing those tediously crafted items in death made its occurrence all the more painful a scenario, which at the start seemed all too common, as venturing beyond the confines of the opening area put you face to face with enemies that could easily slaughter you, so exploration, what should have been the other fun aspect of the game, seemed off limits too. Besides all that, in playing this title firsthand, I picked up on some stuff that I didn't notice through only watching footage of gameplay. For example, you can't manually save, or at least without exiting the game entirely, so if you caught something good in a dangerous scenario, you either had to quit, or risk losing everything to continue playing. So, in the beginning it felt as if too many hurdles prevented me from enjoying the game. In saying that though, after a tad bit of persevering, oddly enough only a little beyond the point of where most YouTubers quit, this game significantly improved. For example, after leveling up enough, resource gathering becomes more of a passive activity rather than a focus, as in your bases, you can eventually construct objects that in a certain sense auto-produce supplies by having your pals tend to them, meaning you no longer have to waste time collecting them, which in turn frees up gameplay. Likewise, with a higher level and better gear, you won't find yourself instantly decimated if a situation got out of hand, which itself opens up a much larger portion of the world to explore, and it's not some straightforward path either, since Palworld possesses an open-world game design. You can go in any direction you desire. In turn, this feature breaks a monotony of the Pokemon franchise, as especially by the game's midpoint, you could have traversed the order of biomes in a completely different way from how others may have. Such locales include an icy mountain, a desert, or a volcano, meaning you will have essentially customized your own journey up to this point, thus allowing you to capture a far wider variety of pals. Basically, it doesn't feel like everyone will harbor a near-identical team at certain parts of the story. For instance, the desert area primarily contains electrical pals, but it does also harbor an extremely powerful fire pal exclusive to the region, so if you ventured here first, your party's Fire Pal representative will most likely be different than if you visited the volcano area first. With the Pokemon series, or at least the ones I know, I haven't played since, I think Generation 5, the games usually follow a pattern of the first area containing a generic bird and mammal, followed by like a bug forest, then a rock cave, so since the series itself, as well as its individual titles pretty much abide by a specific path, it usually feels like everyone experiences the exact same journey, like by the time of the Grass Gym Leader you'll most likely have only encountered one or two lines of fire Pokemon, so again players will presumably have a party quite similar to everyone else at this point. Adding on to this notion, in the wilds of Palworld you can also stumble upon random eggs that might hatch out a pal that you could only normally find in one of the later areas of the game. So again, it doesn't feel like it's a level 25 every Palworld player will have the exact same party. What also adds an interesting twist to the Pokemon formula regards how the home base side of this title allows for your non-party pals to serve a purpose too. Now as someone who has experienced both franchises, I as a player like to catch at least one of every creature I face, and even though I do this practice, the vast majority of the time these creatures never fulfill a purpose beyond that of a box filler. Now once more, Palworld uncovered a way that I can have these critters of mine contribute to my game, as on the home base they can perform menial labor and upkeep jobs, so I don't have to waste time on resource gathering, or at least to the same degree as I formerly did. Like instead of having to go hunt for food, I can have a grass pal plant seeds, or instead of having to break rocks for stones, I can have a ground pal dig them up in a mining site. So yeah, it definitely grants a purpose beyond just filling up space. Palworld even took it a level beyond that, as adding a certain structure allows even your boxed pals to work, as you can send them on expeditions, which if completed can net you hard to find items, so this title really took it a step up on letting nothing go to waste. To say this, with Pokemon I generally find that most people stick with the same party the entire game, or at least other than maybe exchanging one of them for a late game legendary one, while Palworld forces you to expand your party, as the tower bosses of the game, essentially its gym leaders, instead of just operating as normal battles, as you face up against an overpowered version of a normal pal, which pretty much requires you to develop a specific team intended to fight them. Just for reference with Pokemon, I typically find that you can solo an entire gym if you have a strong one with a type advantage, whereas with Palworld unless you happen to be extremely overleveled, you generally need an entire team to defeat them, so not only does Palworld require a more strategic approach, but also forces you to expand beyond a single party. On a side note, some early game pals can still prove themselves useful in the late game too, as some of them have hidden skills that can aid in combat, like Ruby, one of the weakest fire pals can increase the attack stat of all fire pals within your party by 10%, which again can totally make or break a battle against a tower boss. Now one might view having to train pals for only one intended battle as wasteful, even if they can work the base or go the expedition route, but in truth they can aid in another way, as in a later update this game added a raid boss mechanic, where you can have your army of base pals do battle against an extremely strong super boss. Speaking personally, these can be incredibly difficult as two of them wiped out an army of 60 level 60 pals, at the time the highest attainable level, so yeah, this further reinforces having a variety of strong pals. On that note, this aspect contributed to why I said I had ups and downs with this title, as after finally having a great time with this game, my Game Pass subscription trial neared its end, and when I finally had the chance to face these monsters, I ended up utterly obliterated with no chance of beating them with the remaining time of being able to access this title. For reference, you can only acquire these pals by beating them in combat, which in turn gifts you an egg of theirs. Now at the time I never expected I would play Palworld again, so to get them registered as caught, I went into the settings and changed some variables, so I would be able to defeat them on time, which I did. And needless to say, it ended my Game Pass subscription with a sour taste in my mouth. Now after learning that Palworld would receive an update that would throw in some additional pals to the game, that incentivized me to give this title another chance, which would occur in early December of 2025, right before I started working on this list video. After returning the settings to normal, With the first of the 2 raid bosses that previously obliterated me, I beat it relatively quick, since the new update added several strong water pals, which all have a type advantage over it, so the first one was not too big a deal. It only took like 2 or 3 days into my new subscription to best it, but with Xenolord, the stronger of the 2, that one proved a massive challenge. It beat me dozens of times, but on my last attempt with only minutes of my Game Pass subscription to spare, I somehow pulled off a legitimate victory against it, and needless to say this totally redeemed the sour taste in my mouth, and knowing that I came so close to failing made it all the more sweeter a win. Anyway, a week after I lost access to the game again, the developers added into the fray a new raid boss, and I'm already having a fun time devising strategies to overcome it when I rent Game Pass again. Before I conclude, a few quick observations. Now, even though I enjoyed the game itself, I definitely see some areas that need some refinement, like it virtually has no story behind it, and the quests seem extremely unsubstantial, like even if the rewards prove fruitful, it has no accompanying cutscene, or even the switching of camera positioning to make this more significant a moment than a random conversation with an NPC. I honestly like the newly added mini-games to the fishing and salvaging mechanics. In terms of PAL designs, many of them look great, but a lot of thematic repetition can be seen in some appearances. Off the top of my head I can think of like 5 grass types that can be described as a feminine woman wearing a skirt of flower petals. The new raid boss resembles an old deer pal and even shares its typing. Now, if the game adds more means of providing context to these 2 creatures, I think this issue can be rectified, but for now it just feels like an overused design. For Pokemon, what always stood as a minor pet peeve of mine, regarded the superfluous typing. Now I'm not against the mechanic in general, especially when it comes to the more elemental side, as I think it brings out an extra dimension to the battles, but I ask the question, do rock and ground have to be separate types? Or is flying, as a type, really necessary? Like, can't it just be more of an attribute instead? Anyway, I say all this because Palworld reducing the typing to just elements, or at least other than dragon, cleared up an issue I've had with Nintendo's monster catching Goliath for years. On the subject of typing, I must admit Palworld stirs up some of its own complications with the practice, as I'll just say the developers favor certain types a bit too much. As of now, according to the stats, the dark type occupies half of the slots for the top 10 strongest pals. Incidentally, I kind of worry that Palworld may overcorrect this issue by adding in too many raid bosses or legendary pals to give every element a representative, which in doing so, will dilute the ones they already have. Tying the practice of typing back to the bosses, what forces you to think a bit more strategically about the game, regards how you can't exactly spam elemental advantages over the strongest of enemies for an easy victory. For example, the 7th tower boss, as of now the last, harbors an ice-type pal. Now because of that you might think a fire pal would have the advantage, but in truth the boss, despite its pure ice affinity, also knows some water techniques, which will quickly put you on the disadvantage. So with Palworld it definitely feels like more thought got put into making the enemies seem all the more formidable and challenging. On that note, techniques not having to match up with their wielder's type does create a few issues. Now even though a pal being able to learn virtually any move can come off as cool, at the end of the day just cheapens everything, as it becomes more practical to give your pals the 3 best attacks, instead of having them master their own exclusive element. In all honesty, I hope the developers implement something like a 10% boost in power if a pal uses a move in sync with its own typing, or in contrast a 5% reduction for an attack outside of its own elemental classification. Finally, towards the end of the game, I think the breeding mechanic becomes too much of a necessity, as unless you breed perfect pals with specific passive traits, raid bosses and the hard mode tower bosses feel unbeatable, and I think that strips a little fun out of a game centering around catching monsters. To end this off, what really gives Palworld a leg up over Pokemon regards how it casts away all of its counterparts' nonsense, and lets you accomplish everything within the same game. No need to buy alternate copies of the same game just because some creature exists only on one version. No external trading for something as simple as evolution. and not having to go to some event to acquire a super rare monster. By the way, you can also have multiple save files per game, so in other words, Palworld neglects greed, and lets you have everything all in one copy, which better lives up to a slogan like, "Gotta catch 'em all." 43. Ogre Battle 64. 42. Cavern of Dreams. In all honesty, when I first laid eyes upon this game, I assumed it to be nothing more than a generic homage to the aesthetic of the 3D platformers of the Nintendo 64, an ambience and genre I'm admittedly a sucker for, so in spite of my reservations I gave this title a chance, and boy did it prove me wrong. First and foremost, what made me question this title revolved around how it possessed a very childish, near babyish ambience, and the protagonist of the game, a simple and tiny dragon seeking the eggs of his unhatched siblings. Now all of these aspects tricked me into thinking this would be a tale about childhood, but it instead concerns a story about looking at an adult world through the eyes of a child. For example, the second level of the game occurs aboard a skybound, giant talking aircraft, and what obviously serves as a reference to Clanker's Cavern from Banjo-Kazooie. On looks alone you might just view this as some normal 3D platforming world, especially since it acts as a homage, but the deeper you delve into the story, you come to learn that in the far past, this realm had succumbed to war, and the more you explore the lore, you pick up subtle implications that a bygone kingdom created this amiable aircraft for battle. Similarly, the main focus of the third level follows a maternal fish-like creature. Now throughout the game you will find statues in her image, many of them previously served as puzzles, but if you look closely they all happen to be missing their heads, which at the very least hints at a major falling out. What I'm getting is at face value these levels may just seem like standard 3D platformer biomes, when in fact a lot more layers, such as history and culture, exist beneath the surface. Even keep this in mind, with something like Banjo-Kazooie, you've probably never stopped and asked the question of why something like Clanker would be in his cavern, or even just exist for that matter. And that's what makes Cavern of Dreams so fascinating, as even though it heavily serves as a reference to the influences of its developer, it essentially goes beyond its inspirations by creating a deeper lore behind them. Pretentious as this may sound, this game basically has you see through the eyes of the protagonist, you the player, enter into this new and exotic world with little to no understanding of its machinations, probably believing a topic like war being off limits in such a genre, and he the playable character, a dragon too young to even comprehend his own domain, thus no knowledge of what may have transpired in the past, so your own ignorance has you perceive the setting in a face value way a child would. Basically, instead of seeing a machine as a tool of destruction, you might rather perceive it as something inconspicuous or non-threatening. Anyway, that's why I now argue for the childish aesthetic working in the game's favor. Continuing on, this title pulled off a rare feat in the medium of video games, where it actually got better as it progressed. Usually I find the other way around to be the case, where the best ideas occur at the start, and as it goes on it begins to seem rushed or like loose ends tied up together improperly. By the way, I say this not because the start happens to be weak, but because the final area, known as the Gallery of Nightmares, happens to be one of the best levels in all of 3D platforming. In all honesty, it pulled off something that I've been struggling to think of answers to, myself, as even though I'm a fan of the genre, I think levels should now have to consist of environments beyond just desert, haunted house, or icy mountain. At the same time though, I believe too specific of locations will create issues as well, not diving into this now, but I feel the game had in times suffered from this quality in one or two of its levels. As you might interpret from a level known as the Gallery of Nightmares, one element that crafted this into a unique experience revolved around how the protagonist could jump through paintings to transport him to sublevels, one a wide-open post-apocalyptic wasteland where mummy-like entities chase after him. Again, I remind everyone how this world previously endured a war, maybe a coincidence, and one of the other sections entailed traversing a booby trap littered, spiraling upwards, serpentine tower in front of a hellish backdrop. Once more I reiterate that these areas feel almost totally original, and thus not completely overused and explored ideas. Besides the painting-based subworlds, the basement contains a black and white section which induces a sensation of a frozen-in-time historical event. From what I've been uttering the past minute, I've been trying to paint a picture about how this title mastered atmosphere, and I even have to say the first level of the game, what I personally consider the weakest portion of Cavern of Dreams, still possessed a stellar ambience, as it occurred at a pond during the autumn season right before sunset, which promotes a calming, tranquil feeling. Throwing this in as well, I know the consensus tries to argue that the art style of the Nintendo 64 games that this title tries to emulate have aged poorly, but in all honesty I see the opposite, or I view them instead as an aesthetic-driven approach striving for a more impressionistic, emotive, and atmospheric look rather than one purely seeking realism. Back to why I stated this title consistently improved the longer I played. Now during the Gallery of Nightmares section, this game's top 100 placing legitimately jumped up 50 spaces, but then once I collected all of the siblings' eggs, Cavern of Dreams managed to go up 20 more spots. Now I don't wish to spoil anything, as I think you should experience it for yourself, but I'll just state that you gain an ability allowing you to visit previously unreachable areas, and this advancement literally opened up an entirely new dimension to this world. As an example, I'll bring up a less spoilerish one, where atop a rafter you find a diary of the antagonist, and they mention how they burnt themselves on a lava trap aimed at you, and state that they'll be real angry if you don't fall for it yourself. Just to chime in here, I consider that gag is one of the more mid-tier revelations brought about by this new ability. One aspect that separates Cavern of Dreams from the majority of 3D platformers regards how it intentionally neglects combat. The protagonist doesn't even possess a health bar. Now early in the game you acquire a tail whip ability, but it doesn't injure foes, and instead only serves as a means of progressing puzzles, knocking a fruit out of a tree or repositioning a statue. And to me this really meshes well with the childish atmosphere, as well as how the innocent protagonist seems unaware of a tragic history, or in another sense one could perceive this omission as a message of how issues can be solved through means other than just violence. One minor element that ushered in a bit more personality to the game pertained to how you could gather cards detailing the various entities of the world. Now even though that added a lot to this title and its lore, something else impressed me about this quality, as when you open up the menu to read these tidbits, you can see the protagonist's own hands on the booklet containing these cards, and that subtle feature just solidly improved this aspect, as it made this characteristic seem more personable rather than just some option on the start menu. Again, it seems like nothing, but it just meant a lot to me. To conclude this, I must confess an insecurity I have about my relationship to this game, as I feel awkward ranking it as the second best of 2023, the year of which both Corn Kid 64 and Baldur's Gate 3 released, as even though I highly respect the latter, I can't deny feeling like a fanboy ranking a second and 64-inspired title above it, as it heavily suggests a delusional nostalgia or bias on my part. But despite my insecurity, I stand by Cavern of Dreams' placement on my overall list. 41. Silent Hill. 40. F-Zero GX. 39. The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker. 38. Silent Hill 3. 37. No More Heroes. 36. Earthbound. 35. Xenoblade Chronicles X. 34. Nier. 33. Corn Kid 64. 32. Super Mario Odyssey. 31. Hitman, Blood Money. 30. Pokemon Snap. 29. The Warriors. 28. Yakuza. 27. Super Mario 64. 26. Ratchet and Clank. 25. Terranigma. 24. The Legend of Zelda, Twilight Princess. 23. Metal Gear Solid 3, Subsistence. 22. Banjo-Kazooie. 21. Grand Theft Auto 3. 20. Banjo-Tooie. 19. Silent Hill 2. 18. Yakuza 2. 17. Donkey Kong 64. 16. Resident Evil 4. 15. Fatal Frame 2, Crimson Butterfly. 14. Metal Gear Solid. 13. Pikmin. 12. Super Smash Bros. Melee. 11. Grand Theft Auto, Vice City. 10. God of War 3. 9. Dragon Ball Z, Budokai 3. 8. God of War. 7. Nier, Automata. 6. Metal Gear Solid 4, Guns of the Patriots. 5. Psychonauts. 4. Final Fantasy VII. 3. Ratchet and Clank, Going Commando. 2. The Legend of Zelda, Majora's Mask. 1. The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time.
Well, that's the new full list. To end this off,
I personally wish to thank the people who requested I make this video, as without you, I would not have found the inspiration otherwise. As even though I love to express the ideas that keep me up at night, I cannot deny that all the trials and tribulations that come with video productions sometimes makes the allure of simply stepping away seem like all too tempting an offer. So, for the people who gave me that push when I desperately needed it, as well as those who have stuck by me through all these years, with my true voice, I express the deepest of gratitude. For formality's sake, thanks for watching this video, hopefully you all enjoyed it. Fingers crossed my next upload won't be a year away, and likewise not mostly produced with a text-to-speech voice. Anyway, thanks for watching.